had that sixth sense that he was going to win, and here we are. And I think maybe we should start with the kind of people he's putting around him. But in my mind, we've got a very different sort of, there's two groups I'm beginning to see, right? We've got Marco Rubio. We've got, is it his national security advisor pick or nominee, and a couple of other people who are more like, they're very hardline. They are hawkish on, say, China or Iran, but they are still within the realms of reasonable mindedness. They're not Matt Gaetz. They're not RFK Jr., right? There is a spectrum here. You've got people who are a little bit, they're very hard line, but they're still operating within a degree of, realisticness, if that, I can't even think of the right word. But then you've got the other camp, which are just lunatics. And, well, like Tulsi Gabbard, right? She's going to be the national intelligence pick. And I think it was even on Russian state media I saw in the week that they said, oh, well, she's one of our best Russian assets. The Kremlin itself thinks she's a Russian asset. So have you been looking at any of the foreign policy peeps that they're picking, Trump's putting into place, and any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing I'd say really is that sort of point you made about Brexit was, I think, something that's, for a lot of us, from the UK, I think there was that sense of, although everything was saying it was a lot closer, I mean, I think, like a lot of others, it was sort of trying to make sense of something's not quite right here. We are talking about shy Republicans who don't want to admit publicly that they're not going to vote for Trump, but really are? Or was it really a case that, there were a lot of people who were sort of shy Republicans who were saying, well, yes, I am going to vote for Trump, but when they actually got into the voting booth, they were going to vote against him. And, so, I mean, it sounds like, there were a lot of people who were saying this could be more convincing than the polls seem to indicate. But I think the feeling was it was going to be more convincing for Harris rather than Trump. And so to see those results coming out, was certainly very interesting. That, for those of us who sort of very interested in electoral results. And of course, what also is interesting already is that, there are people on the Democrat side who are starting to question, has something gone on here? Because it just didn't seem to make sense. And, we're hearing these views already. So I think that's the first thing to say, that, it was interesting just how convincing it was. And given all the people that had been speaking out about Trump and his policies, not just from a domestic point of view, but obviously from a foreign policy point of view, that there were people saying that this is going to be really, really problematic for the United States. And, obviously we'll touch on that. But I think just to make that initial point that, it was a lot more convincing than many people realized, notwithstanding some of the views that exist about, the legitimacy of the result, which, it really did seem very familiar in that sort of that Brexit sense that, a lot of people thought, oh, well, nobody's going to really vote for Brexit. They're not going to really do something like that, when they get into the voting booth, they'll see sense. And of course, we saw where that got us. So I think that's just the sort of initial point. In terms of the picks, it has been fascinating, hasn't it, to see who's been lined up.
If that's the word you want to use, I wouldn't say fascinating. I'd say disconcerting.
Yeah, I mean, disconcerting. Yes, I mean exactly. But it is also fascinating because, as you rightly point out, that they don't sit comfortably with each other in terms of sort of background, in terms of policy, and you would usually expect. I mean, if Harris had been elected, yes, I mean, you will have differences in personality, you might have differences in sort of priorities, but it's sort of just dancing around a theme that would be actually fairly unifying. So we'd have a fairly clear idea of, and actually, to be honest, with Democrats, it tends to be that it's easier to read where they're going to go. I mean, they do. Traditionally, if I think back over the past 30 years, we've had Trump in obviously in 2016, but also under George W. Bush. It was very hawkish. It was very, we weren't expecting to see what we did. Whereas with Democrats, you tend to have a fairly good idea as to what you're going to be expecting and what you're going to be seeing. So, but in this case now, we really, it's very, very difficult to make sense, isn't it, of where this is going to go, because you've got these, not only these very different personalities, some of whom are considered to be sort of very troubling and seemingly for good reason, but there doesn't seem to be a coherent foreign policy narrative, which is obviously going to be troubling, because you want to have a clear sense of direction. NATO partners are going to want to have a clear sense of direction of where this is going. Other allies in other parts of the world are going to want to have a clear sense of where this is going. And if we're getting these mixed messages that are coming out, it also means that there's going to have to be a much greater reliance, one would imagine, on Trump making the final decision on where issues stand. So very often presidents, will be focusing on, some are more foreign policy oriented, obviously others are more internal domestic policy oriented. But if there's going to be a lot of squabbling between these figures about not only where priorities lie, but also fundamental points of foreign policy, then it's going to be eating up a lot of Trump's time to sort of be, dealing with those battles, or letting them run out of control with all the chaos that will come with that.
Yeah, there's a couple of things here. I mean, you said a lot. So what I'm showing on screen now for peeps is a list of the nominated, currently as they stand, individuals for specific positions. For those of you joining from James's channel as well, hello, my name is Piotr. I'm a fellow international relations wonk as James. I've worked in the UN, I've worked in the World Bank, lived in Africa. I don't know, got my master's from Johns Hopkins SAIS, if any of that means anything to any of you. So I'm not just a guy on the internet, at least I hope not. And James is someone who is very kind enough to collab with me on many different occasions, and we're here talking about Donald Trump in various facets for the next sort of 90 minutes or something. We had a little bit of uploading struggles. We're also going to talk about Blue Sky, and as I said jokingly at the start, James has also requested a specific 6-minute window to talk about the Balkans. So we're going to talk about
anyway. It can be longer than that, but it needs to be. Yeah.
I'm joking. I'm joking. I'm just here to be. James is a lot more refined in his delivery of his perspectives, whilst I'm a bit more bullish and unkempt in my analysis on my channel. But anyway, so we've got Marco Rubio. So he's going to be Secretary of State, most likely. I don't think that's going to be too much of a controversial pick. And from my perspective, James, Marco is, well, I still think we're scraping at the bottom of the barrel in terms of competency in many ways. But when we compared to this bell end, see, I told you guys, compared to this individual, Marco comes across as, I think, as an individual who still will operate within the degree of normalcy and a sort of reasonable expectations, right? He's not going to completely shove the Overton window into the bin. So he's going to be very hawkish, extremely hawkish on China. Michael Waltz is the other gentleman who I think is quite interesting. He's the potential NSA pick. And from looking at his background, he's extremely hawkish on China as well. So the main message I'm getting from this is that, Trump wants to wrap up NATO. Ukraine, or try to. He wants to basically just give Israel all the means it needs to become, do whatever it wants in the Middle East, and so he can dust his hands off, because he wants to focus nearly entirely on the Chinese equation. And I think he's putting, extremely aggressive people in certain places. And, we might disagree even in the next chat about this, because I personally don't necessarily disagree with Trump on every single foreign policy. I do think maximum pressure is needed in certain cases. And I do think a more bullish approach to China, or at least the CCP, is necessary, because they've been interfering in, American elections. They have interfered in British affairs and European affairs. And I'm not a fan of the Communist Party. Does that mean I'm against China? Not at all. But I think having people who are quite gung-ho is different to having people who are quite hawkish. I don't support his pick for, say, a defense secretary. I don't think Pete Hegseth is the best pick for such a senior position. I don't think he's old enough. I don't think he has enough experience. But those are some of my more, should we say, blunt opinions at this moment. I'm not an expert in every single person, so I need to read up on that. But this is sort of, as I said, raw reaction to some of the picks so far. I think the other thing I'd really love your thoughts on is obviously the Musk element in this, because I think it's going to be quite entertaining. In my opinion, I think we're going to see Musk and Trump have I think it was the Washington Post called it the bromance, or the economic, no, there was a particular term, broarchy, like oligarchy, but broarchy or whatever, right? So they try, it doesn't really roll off the tongue, but I don't think it's going to last. I think Trump is going to get fed up with Musk dominating the limelight. I think Musk is going to overreach. I think he has overreached, and I think it's going to come crashing down. What do you think? I mean, I've dumped a lot of information there, but
I was about to say, yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot there. I mean, I think one of the first things that I'd say, which I think has come as quite a surprise to many people who sort of watch this, who are sort of quite immersed in sort of foreign policy circles, is one of the names that was really put forward, and I thought, and I think a lot of others thought, would get a fairly senior position, perhaps as Secretary of State, is somebody called Rick Grenell, who probably means nothing to most viewers. He stood out in the last Trump administration. He was the US ambassador to Germany. He is a Trump loyalist to his core. And he also served as Trump's special envoy to the Balkans, and was very, very active in trying to broker an agreement between Belgrade and Pristina. And actually produced one of the, I mean, it was very interesting. I mean, there were a lot of failures of the previous Trump administration. There were one or two notable successes. Mm-hmm. This was a bit of a bizarre one, because to Trump supporters, it would be seen as a great success. To critics, it would be seen as, at best, meh. At worst, it was laughable. But essentially, what Trump managed to do is get the leaders of Kosovo and Serbia into a room to sign an agreement on economic normalization. And the reason I say that it was a bit of a strange one, and we're sort of touching on Balkans now, is because
is this the 6 minutes? Hang on, let me get the timer up.
All right, so look, I'm just going to we'll do it, but I'm just bringing this up at this stage because I think it's an interesting one, because it was one of the areas that, as I say, Trump presented as a victory under his last administration, that he got the leaders of Kosovo and Serbia into the room, into the White House. It was a laughable picture. You can pull it up online. So Trump sat at the big Oval Office desk, and he's got these two little desks where he's got these people signing the agreement, which, for anyone who might know about the Balkans, it looks rather amusing, because Alexander Vučić, the Serbian president, is extremely tall. And it's almost like his knees up.
Oh, he's massive.
And
He's
Trump
very good.
Exactly. I mean, you put sort of Alexander Vučić and Edi Rama, the Albanian prime minister, in the room together, and I mean, they're both absolutely, they tower above everyone. And you've got this sort of picture of these two leaders sort of like at these tiny desks, and it was very much Trump just trying to show his authority, that he brought these sort of people in. But it was this weird and wonderful agreement that was based on economic normalization, but it was literally, you could see that they'd said, what are we going to put into this agreement? And they went round the room prior to getting them to sign it and said, what do you think is important? Oh, right. Well, we must limit Chinese influence in the Western Balkans. How are they buying in 5G networks? All right. So no buying anything from Huawei. What else? And Rick Grenell's very interesting, because he was the first openly gay cabinet secretary. We use the term rather differently in Britain, but in the United States, effectively a member of the cabinet who was openly gay. And so there was a whole bit in on LGBT rights, for example, in this agreement, that, was just like, well, very laudable, but where did that come from? Oh, yeah, okay. So it really did seem as though everyone had just sort of said, right, okay, this is our particular thing that we think is important and we'd like to see. And so you had this agreement that was done, that was presented as this sort of great success. And so Grenell sort of then was acting as Director of National Intelligence, which is this one that is Tulsi Gabbard has been appointed to, which everyone is so very concerned about. So there was a real sense that Rick Grenell would be in the lineup. He's remained a Trump loyalist, and yet so far he's had none of the senior positions. And that has also raised a lot of eyebrows, because practically everyone else from Trump's first term, I think everyone else from Trump's first term has been excluded, but most of them have had a quite serious falling out with Trump, whereas Grenell doesn't, and yet he's not there. So my sense is that maybe Trump knows that he's going to be in difficult, in difficult territory with a couple of these nominees when it goes before the Senate, and so is holding Grenell back in order to be the replacement. Because he's quite a fiery character. So it's almost a sense that, well, maybe if they put him in first line, he get rejected. But if we see him coming back later on, that somebody else is rejected, then he'll look more moderate compared to some of the others. And so might have a smoother. So that's the theory that seems to be going around, in the absence of any reasonable belief that they've had some sort of falling out, which of course is very possible, but there doesn't seem to be any indication of this. That this, as I say, this particular figure, Rick Grenell, who a lot of people have an eye on, just doesn't seem to have appeared. And I thought that he'd be a very, very strong contender for Secretary of State. So I was very surprised to see when Rubio was put forward for the position.
Yeah, I look, for audience members, as I said, it's an inside silly joke. I did put the timer up there briefly for James, but no, I'm actually very interested to hear what James has to say. And that wasn't maybe even the bit he meant, so we might have the timer back. I am also want to check for everyone watching whether or not the stream is okay. I've seen a couple of comments saying that there's lag, so if you could just drop a comment below saying if it's okay. Apparently the X stream is kind of crap, but that's probably because X doesn't have enough engineers at the moment. YouTube seems fine. And also, this might be the time to mention Blue Sky, James, because you and I have been touching upon this online as well. That there is there were three main potential replacements for X when it first started looking like it was going to be a mess, right? The Mastodon, which never really caught on because it was a bit complicated in terms of how it worked. Threads, which just was dumpy. Threads is really bad, actually. All it seems to be is AI generated women being in very provocative and promiscuous, it's just terrible. So Blue Sky seems to be taking off. They've had they've just surpassed 18 million users now. So if you're more of the liberal perspective of the political spectrum, or you just don't want to use X but you still want to be in political areas, then go on to Blue Sky. James and I are both on there. I've put a link in the chat on my channel at least, of links to mine and James's profiles. It'll be similar for me. It'll be similar to what X is, posting updates or maps or commentary occasionally. So if that's of interest to you, you're fed up with X, it is. A friend of mine, he did a test to see when he posted a video of his YouTube channel on X versus on Blue Sky, and he got 10 times more engagement, and that shows you that X has shifted from being a channel where an app where all the conservatives pretended or claimed that they were being oppressed and censored and shadow banned or whatever. It's completely switched around. James and I don't know about you, James, but I've lost 500 followers. Not that it's all about the numbers, but there's clearly a deliberate attempt to suppress the reach of anyone who is not necessarily liberal. I don't like to use labels, but I'm certainly not, Camp Trump. I'm more moderate. It depends really, but because I've been critical of Musk and Trump on certain areas, I've been suppressed. And because I've worked in establishment organizations, that's probably why. I do believe in the legacy media as not being the worst thing ever. And James, maybe you've been suppressed because you've worked and studied at LSE and taught and things like that. You support the establishment as well. So just a little shout out there to Blue Sky. I don't know, James. Do you think we could see a competitor to X? Just to completely change the conversation for a second, but
yeah, I mean, just as a side on this, no, you're right, Piotr. I mean, it's been really interesting to see. Just so I set up an account there about a year ago, but I only posted a couple of messages. I just didn't feel that, you know, and Twitter at that stage was bad, but it wasn't as bad as it really became. And I mean, it is unusable now. You know, you're just wading through so much just nonsense, and there really does seem to have been a shift this past week, and I've really noticed. And so, like you, I'm moving over to that, and with a heavy heart. I mean, I've been on Twitter since what, I think 2012, so it's been about 12 years. You know, but the one thing I would say is, for anyone who hasn't tried Blue Sky and who is a veteran of Twitter, that it does really feel like Twitter was back when everyone first got started. I mean, the tone of the debate is much nicer. It's much friendlier. There is the moderation. And I think a lot of people have also learned the lesson from Twitter about, you know, look, if somebody just starts trolling you or has been abusive, just block. And, you know, I know a lot of people say, well, but that's not about the free speech. But I saw a lovely comment today. Well, you know, you're still entitled to say what you want, but I'm not obliged to have to listen to it. And, you know, I can definitely see the argument. There are people out there who are saying, look, we need to fight the battle. We need to sort of keep on Twitter for it. But I just think that, you know, all the evidence is that the algorithm has been now programmed in such a way that it is definitely sort of pushing certain messages over others. So yeah, I mean, as I say, it's with a heavy heart. You know, I think like a lot of people sort of you know, had been very attached to Twitter, even though it had been renamed X, this ridiculous decision and everything like that. And yes, there is the argument that we need to keep up with fighting the good fights and sort of keeping you know, keeping what remains of Twitter alive. But I just don't see it salvageable now. And things might have been different had Trump lost the election. You know, then, you know, where would Musk have been and things like that in all of this? But I just can't see. So I think, as I say, you know, sadly, moving over, but Blue Sky is looking very promising, and it's been lovely to see over the past week so many familiar faces suddenly pitching up and sort of, and it does feel like you can have those sensible conversations again. I remember one of the great things about Twitter when I first went onto it was just this sudden realization. It was two things, in actual fact. It was that wonderful sort of the world's news being brought to you, rather than the old way that you'd have to go out and sort of go and try and find it. And all right, yeah, you know, people would say, well, there's feeds and stuff like that. But for most people, it literally was just like trawling around different news websites every morning to get the news. And here you had just like headlines coming out, all brought to you. But it was also that sense of community that you could ask questions and you would get really great answers very quickly. And Blue Sky definitely feels like it's more of that. And as I say, lots and lots of great names have moved over to it. So I'd say to anyone who hasn't checked it out to give it a look.
Yeah, I think a couple of points I would make is that, well, very interesting. You know, I posted a link on my community page for my account if people are interested in following me. I've also got it up here, guys. It looks very similar, right? It's very similar to Twitter. This is James's profile. So you can see that they don't suppress external links, which I think is a good thing. Musk's attempt to extern it, and this is if you want to read, this is you know, I was on live on here, obviously, and then mine, you know, it's very similar, right? It's very similar to Twitter, but what they don't do is suppress external links, and I think that that's a really good thing, because Musk did that, and I think it was an extremely bad move, because it meant you can't keep everything within Twitter. That's just not how it works. Not all information is aggregated on Twitter, but Twitter was a great place for breaking stuff. I do think that Musk has made a couple of improvements to like the quality of use, like in terms of the interface. Like he has improved the ability to like fast forward videos, or he's finally added the feature where you can italicize and bold certain words if you want to, which is something you could only do on the desktop. So he has improved certain things, but in terms of the overall experience, this idea of blocking someone, but you can still see their profile, but you can't interact with it because you're blocked. Why? What is that's just mute, but more ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. And I think what was very revealing to me about the community post was I got at least a few comments from people who view my videos and obviously have an alternative opinion to me, or think that what I talk about is a lot of rubbish. And they said, "Oh, so you're running away from X to Blue Sky. You can't take it, you snowflake." No, I'm not running away. I'm just diversifying. I'm not leaving X. I'm not probably going to be as active on it if I can't have any reach, but I'm certainly not going to leave. No, I mean, maybe you're different, but I don't leave. I just combat. Maybe it's mentally health terrible for me, but I'm planning to stick around with it.
I mean, there, I think, we do differ. I mean, it's a difficult one to break. There's no doubt about it. And, but I've got to the view that it's just not worth engaging. The level of engagement and the hostility, and yes, occasionally you'll get sort of positive, which would be really nice, but on the whole, it just doesn't seem, and there is just so much awful that's just fed on that. And no, so it would really be bad. If you go on the For You, it truly is appalling now. Whereas if you go to the people you follow, most of the people I'm following now seem to have made the jump. So it's just becoming, any benefit that there was on that right-hand column of the people you follow has now disappeared. And I just don't want to wade through the For You, because it's a horror. It really is.
Well, they've done that. So I benefited a lot from the Twitter Spaces, because when Ukraine first started, or the full-scale invasion first started, that's really what triggered my journey, if you like, or kickstart my journey into the world of podcasting, live streaming, being a public face. Well, not that I'm a public face, but being more public on the internet, sticking my face on the internet everywhere, and assuming that people would like that. And it was Clubhouse where I first did that, and the social audio aspect I seem to be good at. I seem to convey myself better through oration than I do through writing stuff in 150 characters. And I built up a platform there. And then because the Clubhouse owners and creators are idiots and didn't listen to creators like myself who said, you should do X, Y, and Z, because Clubhouse could have been like a 24. Basically, we ran a 24-hour news station. It became called the Ukraine Sitrep Room, and reached over 1.5-2 million people in that time, raised tens of thousands for the war in the first 100 days, did a lot of stuff. But they started fiddling with the app, and so I shifted over to Twitter, and Spaces were awesome. But what they've done now is that by having the For You tab, right, which is usually just 90% Musk because of the way he's artificially changed the algorithm, that's the only way you can see the Spaces. So if I want to just be on my following tab, which I much prefer because it's actually people that I want to follow, I can't see the Spaces. So it's all been manipulated in a way to make sure that what you see is what, well, the new owners want you to see. And I think it's really sad. Also because it doesn't encourage engagement anymore. It does just silo. We've got X for that, or for them, or for that community. We've got True Social, and now we're going to have Blue Sky, and a lot of people who use YouTube think it's very liberal, and a lot of conservatives don't like YouTube and they prefer what's the video version, the one that all the other people are on, the one oh, for fuck's sake, I can't remember the name of it. It was created by the Russians, the green, it has the green emblem, the green logo, the recording one. I can't remember. All right, you guys know what
I can say about. Honestly, I steer clear of it.
You know the one I mean, Rumble, right? Rumble, that's the one. Oh, I was Rumble because I couldn't think of the name.
The famous Rumble.
Anyway, so there you go. So anyway, I don't know. That's everything I wanted to say on that. I don't know if you want to stick around, or should we move on to something?
Yeah, I think. Anyway, anyone who might be interested, we're both on Blue Sky, like.
Yeah. Basically, everyone, if you get rid of X, there is an alternative now. And could it be? There was an article I was reading in the New York Times, Sky News as well. Could it undermine X? Could it actually make X implode?
I think it's definitely going that way. I mean, we already had the Guardian's already announced that it's going to leave, and that's a fairly heavy weight in terms of an online presence. But the real question, of course, is when political leaders and other sort of organizations also start to leave en masse, that's going to. I mean, I think they said that sort of the most senior sort of political figure who at the moment is Donald Tusk, from former sort of the European Union, who is now back in Poland and serving there. He's gone on to Blue Sky, and I think be looking to see if there's a real move, and things like government departments and things like that. That's when Blue Sky will really, really take off, is that once you start to see it become a real hub for information, as the way that Twitter was, and a lot of these organizations sort of leave. So yeah, going to be very interesting, and that also is going to be important for things like how can we see, if you've now got Musk part of the Trump administration, you won't presumably see US government departments moving over to Blue Sky. They'll remain very much tied in with Twitter X.
Good point.
So that will, in its own way, I think, probably sort of give Twitter or X. I just can't get used to calling it X, and I don't want to. Maybe I should, because that's the way that you sort of say goodbye and break with the past. But on, as I said, on the serious note, I mean, it's going to be difficult to see US government departments now breaking with X and going over to Blue Sky for that reason. That you've got the owner of X sort of now effectively becoming Trump's right-hand man.
Yeah, I think that I'm reading through the comments, and people are getting fed up with us talking about social media. They want us to talk international relations.
Get on with talking about what Trump's going to do to the world.
Yeah, but I think that's a good point, though. It kind of ties in everything that you're saying, which is that do government departments begin to diversify? Right, we don't see government agencies using Instagram in that way. Twitter did. That's why Twitter was so popular or so important, because it had that comparative advantage that there was nothing else really like it. Truth Social was largely just Trump's, cult faction, and Blue Sky now will probably be the more liberal version. And so maybe it will improve, and then maybe Threads will start picking up. Who knows? But okay, so what I'm very interested for your perspective as well is, obviously, from my mind, what's clearest is that we know Trump's trade policy. He's tariff man, he's drill baby drill man when it comes to energy. And I think, he wants to set between 10 to 20% flat rate tariffs on all imports from every country. Now, the cost to the UK, for example, the first data I could find, it's going to cost the UK in terms of its exports about $22 billion. So very sizable for a country which has obviously left the EU and is in a arguably worse situation than, I think, continental Europe. But at the same time, he wants to slap 60% tariffs on China, minimum, 200% of its EVs and other certain niche industries. So do you have any perspectives on Trump's potential trade or economic policies and how that could play into the IR of it, if that makes sense?
So look, I mean, I'm almost hesitant to admit it, but all right. So my first degree was in economics and politics, so I'm not completely
okay, good. We're perfect to talk to you about.
Illiterate on this, but I wouldn't claim to be a trade expert or anything like that. But I mean, one of the things that has been pointed out, I mean, there are several important points. One is that it's effectively going to be the importers in the United States who are going to be picking up the tabs for this. So that will be passed on to US consumer, which is all right, fine. If you say the ultimate goal is then for US manufacturers to be able to take that work, produce those products instead of China, and that's going to either open China up more to US products, and remembering US tends to be high tech, and so that will be it. All right, okay, we'll continue to take your cheap sort of clothing goods, but you will buy aircraft and things like that from the United States. That, I'm sure, is the sort of thinking behind it. But in the meantime, it seems like there is going to be a very, very heavy price to pay for your average US consumer, because if the US companies cannot replace those goods that have been lost to massive tariffs, or if they can, they're still going to be producing them at a higher rate. That surely is going to be feeding inflation in the United States. People are going to feel it. And so the argument would be, well, yes, but we'll start manufacturing those things, or it'll feed the US. It really seems uncertain at the moment how this is all going to work, and it sounds like it's a sort of attention grabbing idea that has been put forward by some that hasn't really been, really thought about, what are the knock-on consequences. And again, before anyone says, oh, how can that possibly be? But this was exactly what we saw with Brexit, of course. That, let's do this. And people were saying, oh, but, famous Daniel Hannan, who people have regularly pointed out. I mean, anything he says seems to be wrong. He's saying nobody's threatening our place in the single market. Boris Johnson was saying, oh, of course we'll remain in the single market. It was all cakeism. It was all this sort of sense that no, it won't harm our trade, but we'll be free to make our rules. Showing a fundamental lack of understanding and basic ignorance and illiteracy when it came to sort of economic matters, and how sort of European free trade and the single market worked and the customs union worked and all of those aspects. So I think, as we touched on at the beginning, there's a real sense that anyone who's been through that Brexit experience no longer is sort of lax about the degree to which populists can come up with policies without having given it any real thought about the consequences. It might sound great to say to your average American voter, yeah, we're going to slap taxes, tariffs on goods coming from China. And that is going to be terribly popular, especially for a large part of the US where, people will feel that their jobs have been taken and, offshored in over the past sort of 20, 30 years. And so sort of winning them back. But it's going to be a difficult process, and it's going to be an expensive process. And again, without wishing to labor the point about Brexit too much, but, most people now would admit that Brexit has been economically difficult for the UK. By natural inclination, I'd say it's an economic disaster, but, let's sort of be sensible about it. But, when you've got senior figures who are now, who at one point were more bullish about Brexit and supportive of it, saying that yes, it's done a lot of damage, then you can see that people could very well be hit hard by it. And I think the one example that people often raise is that there will be a few who will do, they think, better out of it. So, for example, one of the arguments that you heard from Brexit was that the influx of cheap labor from Eastern Europe actually hurt a lot of tradespeople in Britain, painters, decorators, these sorts of people. And some would say, oh, but we're doing so much better now because we haven't got cheap Polish plumbers coming in and everything like that. But of course, yes, all right, your income might have gone up, but we've also seen inflation that's driven by labor shortages. And a lot of people who supported Brexit said, no, it's been caused by COVID and everything like that. But no, I mean, even Rishi Sunak, when he was prime minister, admitted, and this was somebody who wasn't a late stage Brexiter, by the way. He wasn't a Remainer who won over. He campaigned for Brexit. Even he was admitting that a lot of the costs that the UK was experiencing a couple of years ago with inflation was labor-driven inflation. It was shortages that were coming from there. So I think this is exactly the sort of thing that we could very well see hit the United States. And given that inflation was such a fundamental part of the reasoning why so many people voted for Trump, I think this is going to be really, really interesting to watch how that's going to play out. So the economics of the whole Trump administration, leaving aside the foreign policy of it, although it is going to be tied up with conflicts with China and close allies, because if you start slapping on a 20% tax on Britain, which, again, the Brexiters said, oh, don't worry, we leave Europe, we open up the rest of the world, not least of all America. Well, that's gone out the window. Leaving the foreign policy side of it, I think even just from a straight economics, there are some very, very real questions to be asked about how this is all going to play out.
Yeah, I would say the first thing really is that, amusingly, there was a statistic, a graph, an assessment, a time series, I guess, depicting Americans' view of the economy after the election, and confidence in the US economy had been at an all-time low because Biden. And as soon as Trump won, oh, how do you feel about the economy? Oh, it jumped back up. So basically, it's that sort of is it the Mandela effect? If I'm getting that right, it's that psychological term whereby you think, or was it placebo? It's the perceived reality of something.
Yeah,
Nothing's actually changed yet. It's just, oh, well, because we've got an incoming person, some American voters are already associating an uplift in the economy with Trump, even though the guy's not entered yet. I think one of the things a lot of economists and analysts have been confused about also is why so much disdain for the economy, or for sense of the economy, despite the US recording 2.8% growth in the third quarter. Inflation was going down, it wasn't at targeted levels yet. Basically, the economy wasn't that bad, and the average growth, as I say, of the US economy was far outstripping any other advanced economy, any other OECD member. Europe's average growth has been 1.2%. But that's more than half than what the US is achieving usually, and it's very effective. So, are we going to see a bit of a honeymoon period where people think, it was a bit like when Trump came in on his first term, right? He benefited a lot from the time lag effect of the Obama late policies that were introduced, and a lot of people associated that with Trump, but it wasn't necessarily just down to his own decisions. It was also because of what Obama had laid the groundwork for. This isn't necessarily, I'm not defending Obama and everything. I also wanted to make a couple points. Like, there's going to be, I think, a huge realignment in terms of, I don't think Trump's a pure out isolationist. I think he's a protectionist. He wants, he's a nationalist who wants to utilize protectionist policies to ensure American industries are either salvaged or reclaimed or something like that. And I do think you're going to see an upscale in terms of the US-Canada, or, as it used to be known, NAFTA, now it's USCMA deal. Although the actual volumes in trade when Trump renegotiated that deal didn't change. It was just literally changing the name so that the US was at the start of the banner of the trade deal. I think that was the most impressive difference. So I think that's going to be interesting to watch. For Europe, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but European policymakers in Brussels have been making retaliatory measures in place, or making steps to create such policies and responses mechanisms in case Trump won, for several months now. And I think there's going to be substantial consequences for this aggressive trade stance by the Trump administration. I think the US market, there's a trade deficit of about $130 billion. And the US may want to seek, I think, a negotiation to redress some of that balance with Europe. And generally, I think EU-US trade is going to be heavily dependent upon what happens with NATO and Ukraine, obviously. But then sort of the one I do want to dive into a little bit more with you specifically is China, because what we're going to see here is, I think, hugely dependent on also EU trade with China. EU-China trade was worth about $739 billion, I'm just reading here, in 2023. And Chinese products are heavily integrated with the EU supply chain. So if Trump wants to force the capitulation of Europe to sort of fall in line with his China strategy, could he try to leverage even tougher trade and economic policies against his own allies to achieve his goals with China? Could it be a backhanded approach?
I mean, sorry if I was sort of looking down. I was just trying to make a note, because there's a number of really great points that you'd sort of raised that I think, it's worth
get a notepad, actually.
Yeah, I was sort of just, that's effectively what I was doing. So I think on the first point, I mean, you're right. There's been a sudden glut of confidence amongst certain in the United States, and you're right. Economics, so much of it is about confidence. It's about consumer and business confidence in how the economy is going, and that can float economies. We know that, but you still run up against hard economic facts. So no matter how confident people are, if in a few months down the road Trump has got through with these tariffs and people are starting to feel the effects in their pocket, that's going to have an effect. So, confidence is great. Confidence can keep an economy bubbling along. And that's why so many governments are so keen to keep confidence high, especially if it looks like an economy is going into, is heading into recession. everything in their power to keep that confidence going, make sure that people are still going out there and buying and not getting nervous about the state of things and thinking, right, what, I've got to be a little bit careful. And then, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So there's that problem. But again, you have hard economic facts that you're going to be up against. And so I think that's going to be interesting. The second point, I think, which comes into all of this is that point that you made about many of the data points of the US economy are actually a lot better than people believed. And I think that this is something that also touches on the whole major problem that we're encountering anyway in lots of places. And, and it's very difficult to say this without sounding overtly party political or, left versus right. But what we have seen, and again, Brexit was a very good example of that, is that on the political right, there's a much willingness to lie, to just come out and say what needs to be said to win. And so just say to people that, immigration is massively up when lots of the figures show that it's actually been going down, or vice versa. Saying it was, Democrats had sort of pushed it up. And what we've seen is, and the same with inflation. We know that there were very good reasons why inflation had been high, but in actual fact, the United States had weathered a lot of those economic shocks that the whole world has encountered. I mean, COVID, for example, it had weathered it a lot better, and the US headline inflation rate was actually lower than in many other places. So it couldn't get away completely from it, but it did a lot better. And one of the things that I often lament about this populism is, by its nature, it will say anything that is going to appeal to the base instincts of voters. Whereas I've always felt the problem that the Democrats have, and this is what they're going to have to really get their head around, because this is exactly the same problem that existed in the UK, is that when you're up against a political opposition which is willing to say anything and lie in order to get into power, and you have your particular position that you don't want to go down that path, how then do you counter it? Because the reality is that reality is complex, and very often trying to explain complexity to people, their eyes glaze over, you lose them. They want to hear the message. They want to hear the message, yes, there's too many immigrants, and everything like that. But when you start to try and break it down and say, yes, look, we have got high numbers of immigration, but we also have to take into account the X, Y, Z factors that have got to be taken into account. People get lost at that. They just want to say, they're just told immigrants are coming and they're stealing our jobs and stealing our welfare. Always a remarkable contradiction that, didn't seem to make sense to anyone. If all of them were coming over and just taking welfare, then why were they sort of like stealing jobs? Anyway, by the by, these are the sorts of things that you're up against, and trying to explain that complexity is another issue. And so I think in the British case, and we've seen even with Labour, that eventually it just was the case that the Conservatives were so utterly rubbish at running the country that, no amount of dressing it up could cover it up anymore. But since Labour has come to power, we've also seen the onslaught from, for example, the right-wing press and everything against Labour. And so Labour's actual favourability ratings are much lower than one would expect, considering, how bad things have been. So I think, we have to bear that in mind as an issue. There's two other quick points that I want to just on what you were going to say. The first is the European Union, and you're absolutely right. I mean, if the United States is picking a trade war with the European Union, there will be significant fallout from this. I mean, for everyone. But one of the things that I often, again, without labouring the point, but I am, on Brexit, is that people would say, oh, we've won back our sovereignty. We can do what we want. We set our own rules. But that's not the case. The European Union is now an economics powerhouse. And, I always tell people, just go out and Google something called the Brussels effect. Because it's a concept that basically says that the European Union is now such an important market that its regulatory framework is naturally adopted by a lot of other countries and other companies, because simply, companies, if they've got any eye on exporting, Europe is a huge market. It's a wealthy market. If the European Union sets rules, those companies will just simply follow them, because it's too costly to start. And, we've seen when companies have tried to fight it, even Apple, over the phone chargers, for example. So Apple was sticking with the Lightning charger, and European Union said, listen, we've got to stop all these different types of chargers and everything like that. This is better for the consumer. It's better for the environment. Let's move over to USB-C, which anyone who knows about USB-C will tell you there's all sorts of different forms of it. So it's not quite the all-in-one. But it should help matters. And Apple tried to fight it and eventually had to give up. And then you had that wonderful thing of Britain saying, you know what, we'll introduce USB-C as well. I mean, the reality was that, the UK could not fight against it. If Apple had to give in because the European Union had demanded it, there was no way that Apple are going to continue making Lightning, for just for the British market, putting it on the bottom of their iPhones. And all the other phone makers had already switched over to USB-C. So this is one of those examples that I think is fascinating of how the EU, controls. So what you're left with is it comes back to this idea of autarky. The US saying, are we going to become essentially our own market? And this is, I think, the real question about what maybe Trump's trying to do. But what does that say then if the United States is effectively cutting itself off from the rest of the world and saying, yeah, we'll make everything internally, we'll do everything, we'll just become a closed economy, because we picked fight with China, we picked fights with the European Union and other partners. And meanwhile, they'd say, oh, well, maybe we could keep markets going in Asia and Africa. But look, it's China that's getting into that. And if they're given the choice, in a lot of cases, they'll pursue the European Union's marketplace rather than the United States, especially if the United States has imposed, tariffs on goods from everywhere. If you're a Kenyan exporter, you're probably going to be aiming more for the European Union than the United States at that point. So it raises some really, really deep questions across the board about where all this is going. And I know we weren't going to really talk about economics, but I think it's such an interesting area to be thinking about.
Yeah, no, look, I like to cover economics on the channel a lot, because I think it's an incredibly integral part of anything. And if you don't, then you're only really doing a half-hearted job of, not you personally, but I think, it's important to quantify what you're talking about and what you're doing. And that's why when I did my master's at SAIS, it was so important. And I think why it's quite a respected degree, because it forces you to put into physical practice and reality what some policies mean, not just in the theory of like, oh, well, this middle power is going to change X, Y, and Z. What's that mean in IR, realism and neoliberalism and blah, blah, blah? Like, what's it actually going to do to the markets and trade, and therefore us as consumers and so on. Now,
by the way, can I just say maybe very, very quickly on one thing on that point, because it's one of the things that I absolutely always say that, to students. So if there is anyone who's studying international relations or planning on studying international relations who might be watching this, is listen, if there's two subjects that I think anyone who's interested in international politics should do alongside of it, it's economics and law. Absolutely. They're so fundamental. It's about understanding how international law works, but also understanding how the international economy works. You tie those in with international relations, and you've got all the bases covered. So just had to sneak that little bit in.
Yeah, so I've put on the page now, the classic expression, America innovates, China replicates, Europe regulates. I don't personally agree with this, but it kind of, I think, is what a lot of more right-leaning members of the Trump fan base will say, which is that Europe is socialist, or in some extreme cases, it's communist, right? I am living in Soviet Russia. My father would be proud. And, because the EU wants to standardize certain regulations or expectations around policy and tech and things like that, they introduce a lot of regulations which Americans argue stifles innovation. It stifles creativity. But that's not true, because if you look at an index, which is the really, really smooth title of the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, Britain actually ranks as one of the highest, I think, in the top 2 or 3. The US is obviously up there, but the UK regulates quite a lot as well. So it's not as simple to say that because the European Union is regulating so much, it's stifling creativity and innovation. That's just not true. If that was the case, then you wouldn't have companies still existing there. They would all relocate to the US, right? It's just because the European Union prioritizes, or Europeans more specifically, I think, prioritize welfare over just working. Europeans live to live, whilst Americans live to work, is the expression. And obviously, I'm not saying this applies to everybody, but that sort of, there is a change, a difference in priorities, I think, between the two. And also because the EU is a set of 40 collective nations versus America, which, yes, the states are different. California is very different to Texas, but generally there's a unified ideology there versus Europe, which has quite a big difference, I think. So, I don't really agree with this notion all the time. And I personally would much prefer to live in Europe than the US. There's no hatred to my American friends. I've lived there for 5 years. But, I have the European mentality, and that's why I hate Brexit. And to come to Brexit, a lot of what you said, it's obviously very reminiscent. I would disagree with you personally on framing it as left versus right. Maybe the right lie, but it depends on the type of right. I think traditional conservatives can still be accurate. They might,
I mean, I'm not wishing to pass, but I think we've realised a lot of traditional conservatives, the political spectrum has shifted. So,
sure.
A lot of people who would consider traditional conservatives would probably be regarded as more centrist these days. So,
for sure. The Everton window's moved to such an extent that what was considered to be traditional conservatism is now, some of them, what did they call Mitt Romney the other day? He's a rhino. No, he's not. He's one of the most traditional conservative Republicans there is. Just because he doesn't agree with MAGA republicanism means he's sort of a socialist now? What are you talking about?
I'm that can remember when Reagan was president.
Oh, well, he's a socialist as well, isn't he?
It's sort of, so I'm sort of, and, when George H.W. Bush, for example, and, just remembering some of the greats of the Republican Party, you're thinking how they must be now, if they were around, how would they be looking at the party? I mean, people like Eisenhower, for example, you can only guess, this is to look at where it's come from, whereas the Democrats haven't shifted nearly in the same way. But I'd just like to also pick up on that point about regulatory, because I think you hit on a really good point, and this is another thing that I often raise, like you, the difference between the United States and Europe is that, I know in a lot we'll say Europe is overregulated and everything, but I mean, there is fundamentally a different political outlook that shapes how Europe approaches the world and approaches economics and business. And essentially, the way I like to boil it down is that it's about a compact between left and right. And so Europe says to companies, we will give you a massive market, 450 million people, the wealthiest consumers in the world. But in order to do that, you're going to treat your workers right. You're going to give them proper holiday pay. You're going to give them proper maternity leave, paternity leave, sick pay. There's still a belief. So it's a fundamental different ideology, of course, that drives. And you're right. I mean, some would say, well, we prefer the US approach to things. But then a lot of people, and I've seen this, I've taught a lot of Americans, I've seen when they've come to Europe and realized, they're told one thing about how socialized medicine works. But when they see it up close, and notwithstanding the problems that the NHS has had in recent years, but when they've seen it up close and realized that, it actually does deliver a lot of good, and it's societies where, yes, taxation is higher, but it means that people, if they fall ill, don't fall through the cracks in the system. It's a very different outlook. So again, look, it's personal ideology, but I do make that point in Europe to present it as sort of socialist is incorrect, because at its heart, the single most important project in Europe really has been the single market. And if you want to say, right, what else? When it's free movement of people, which is essentially based on economic free movement. And it's also on the euro, which again facilitates free trade. You know, it's built on building economic ties and strengthening. So the idea that it's just this communist EU SSR, which, you know, we've had, is very tedious. It's just underpinned by a different outlook and ideology that, yes, companies, you should be able to have the best advantages of being able to trade across the entire continent, have these free open markets, but the payback is that you're going to treat your workers right.
Yeah, and I would say, well, I maybe alluded to it, but it's not just based on monetary returns, right? There's a lot of things, as you said, that you benefit from in Europe. Americans earn what, on average, I think it's about $65,000 now. The highest income on average, I think, in Europe is about, well, excluding micronations like Luxembourg or Liechtenstein or Monaco or something ridiculous, is about 57,000. But that doesn't take into account certain things like welfare and social security things, you know, other aspects that are quality of life. It's not just based on money. And, you know, I've got friends of mine. I work for an organization at the moment which has a branch in America, and the different in terms of policies that we have and the options that I have, they earn more, but I have access to a really nice membership place, a club in London here. I have, you know, much more reasonable hours. My off time is much more reasonable. And when you talk to an American who doesn't appreciate sometimes just how much, I think, time off, you know, 21 days or 25 days off, which in some cases might not even be that much, to some, they can be often very surprised. So it's not only about money, I think, in Europe. It's more multifaceted than that. And, you know, so it depends, you know, again, this isn't necessarily criticism. I just think it's also different.
I mean, and I know we sort of, you know, this is probably a little bit different from what, you know, we were expecting to talk about, but, you know, this point about regulation and you know, deregulating markets. But again, we saw this at the time of Brexit. They would say to people, right, okay, tell us what are the regulations you'd like to get rid of? And in actual fact, there were remarkably few.
Well, the Eurobarometer
is in many cases, you know, is introduced for very good reasons. You know, that you want to make sure that, you know, products are built to a certain standard, but for safety reasons. You want to make sure that your food is produced to certain, you know, to a certain standard for very good health reasons.
No,
you know,
for
it's
sure.
not as simple as just saying let's deregulate everything like that. And I think this is one of the things that again is going to come out very clearly in the Trump administration. If they're saying they're going to deregulate, what is it going to be? What is it going to be, and what are the effects of that going to be? And the other point to bear in mind is that if the US is deregulating, and you know, our company is going to follow on board with that because it'll be cheaper, but cheaper for the domestic market, but it's going to severely curtail their ability to export, because, you know, Europe is not going to take US food if there's, I mean, it already has a problem with a lot of it, but if there's any further deregulation, then you can say goodbye to any of that. And in other areas, so again, it's going to come with it's going to be an opportunity cost to this. You know, are you just going to appeal to your domestic audience in America? And you might then offset some of the costs of importing goods if these tariffs are going in, but it's going to have a knock-on effect. So, you know, all of this it's again, I'll use the word fascinating, but I think we could use far stronger terms about what the potential impact of all this is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, look, I know we had perhaps a slightly different idea of what we were going to talk about, but I don't think that this is in any way not related to what we're talking about. Maybe it's a bit more meta. But I think it's very relevant because we are at a crossroads in Europe and this all plays obviously back to Trump in the sense of he is going to reshape geopolitics, the global economy, and Europe is going to be one of the ones caught in the middle in a way that you might not expect, but it is because the severity of the relationship of Trump to certain parts of the European Union or European states are going to vary significantly. And it's going to be the sort of thing where I want Europe to be more strategically autonomous, right? To paraphrase Macron and his idea of this, Europe being more independent in terms of its security provisions, energy security, economic welfare, all these sorts of things. And it's a shame that it's got to take a sort of backhanded approach, if that makes sense, to kick European policymakers into doing what they should have done a long time ago, right? We shouldn't be as dependent on other entities as we are, and we can see that with Ukraine, obviously, to bring in that very important, because European nations have been too much, I think, resting on their laurels. They've been very negligent, or just sort of, we can freeload a little bit, and that's where I do support Trump's perspective, in that too many countries, particularly a couple of very large economies, have been, benefiting from US security assurances and not pulling their weight. And I completely understand Americans who are frustrated with that, because it's very true. So that's something that we can touch upon maybe in just a second. But I wanted to just also cover the UK, because since we are obviously English, but I think there was a very interesting article a couple of days ago I was reading, and it was talking about the former head of the World Trade Organization, Pascal Lamy, who said that, the UK is going to have to make a big choice here. The UK has always tried to, before Brexit at least, it was always trying to dabble between being the bridge between, US and Europe, and being the transatlantic sort of go between. But with the change of Brexit and Trump back now and everything, that's just not going to work. And so Britain has to pick whether it goes to quote unquote EU socialist model, or as Stephen Moore has called it, or whether they're going to get closer with the Europeans and try to emulate some of the policies that the Europeans have been, although I think they have been largely. And I think I'll land with this point and pass it back to you. But I think what is evident of that was Macron's invitation of Starmer to Remembrance Day, right? Just earlier last week, right? That's the first time in 7 decades or something like
Amazing
that.
Think, isn't it? Yeah.
So clearly, I think Macron is doing that as a symbolism, but also a way to really share an olive branch or a handout to the UK to because I don't think there's going to be an opportunity. Let's say things in Britain go messy and we get a more right-leaning entity again in 2028, right? This is the best opportunity I think the UK and the Europeans have to work together in a sort of degree of centrism, right, moderacy in the political spectrum, to build a deeper relationship and a support of one another against the very volatile global trade war that seems to be coming with the Trump administration. What do you any thoughts?
No, I think you sort of make a really good point that there does seem to be a view at the moment the UK is going to have to make a choice, and can say, well, no, we want good relations with Europe and the United States, but I think there's if those two are going to go into economic confrontation with each other, then the UK is going to be caught in a very difficult position in the middle. But again, we come back to this issue of regulation, which is really central to a lot of this, which is, does the UK open the market to deregulated US goods? And also, the reality is that Trump is extremely transactional. I don't think there's any sentimentality there towards Britain. He might say that, his Scottish roots and all the rest of it, but I don't think there is going to be. And one of the things we know is that there are a couple of areas that United States would want to crack open. I mean, one would be agriculture and the other would be pharmaceuticals. The NHS is a huge buyer of medicines. And the United States has always felt very, very unhappy about the fact that the UK bargains hard through the NHS to get very good rates on US medicines. And so there is a sense that, if Britain wants a trade deal with the United States, well, these are going to be the two areas. And are British consumers going to be willing to go for US GMO crops across the board? And at the same time, how will the NHS budget be affected if it has to pay closer to American prices for many drugs than it's currently managing to pay at the moment. And that is going to, and we already know that, this is an area which is becoming an increasingly tough area for any healthcare service in the world. Medicines are expensive. The NHS has a certain power in it, but what happens if it loses that? And I think there will be a real choice, and you'll have the ideologues who say, well, we should go with the United States because you have people in Britain who are allergic to the to the European Union. But for Starmer, he's going to have to start making some decisions. And, frankly, his policy on Europe has been nonsensical. And it's not that, look, like a lot of other people, I understood that he wanted to play down Brexit. It was deeply wounding. And the debate was horrific. I mean, you remember as well as I do that, between 2016 and 2022, it was awful. I mean, it was really, and, the UK has started to recover. It's become less of a salient issue. It's in public discourse anyway, in private. And for anyone who knows about this, we know what an effect that Brexit's had, but it's been kept low on the political agenda. And I understand why Starmer wants to do that. But the trouble was he was also saying things which were completely unnecessary and actually, frankly, rather silly. So, it's fine to say, look, we've left the European Union. I have no intention of rejoining. Fine. All right. That's it. That we can. But to say we've left the European Union, there's no economic case for ever rejoining. And I don't see that happening in my lifetime, or there's no economic case for being in the European Union, and I don't see it happening. Why? Why to say things like that? Because there is every economic case to be in the European Union or to be in the single market. So to say, you can say, look, it was politically divisive, and I respect the democratic decision. I might have disagreed with it, but I'm going to respect it. But to then take it that further step and just say, no, there'll be no talks about single market. And all he needed to say is, when he was put on the spot on it, is say, if elected prime minister, my intention and my first priority is to do what's best for Britain. And I'm not going to take rash decisions which go against that, but I am going to weigh up the evidence and make those decisions. But any decisions that we will be made through democratic procedures. It will be debated in Parliament. He could have just sort of left the door open to have a freer hand than he has at the moment, because now he's left himself in the situation that anything he wants to do, he's just going to be called a flip-flopper and everything. And I always think that's a ridiculous argument anyway. I mean, it was as John Maynard Keynes once said, when circumstances change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? It's so true that you need to have that flexibility, but we know we live in an era where that will be jumped on. And I think he just made some very silly mistakes. So that's, sorry, just to get my take on where.
No, I asked you, so that's very interesting to know. I personally have been equally very frustrated with Keir's lackluster approach. I think he needs a bit more conviction. I think it's gumph is a good word to use in this sort of situation. I obviously, like you, am vehemently against what Brexit meant and has done. Not to sound too selfish, but it really did screw over my generation, millennials, and obviously subsequent ones going forward. And I think that moving forward to outrightly reject any notion of rejoining at any way, shape or form in your lifetime, it's an unnecessary overstep, which doesn't really add anything to the current discourse, and if anything only is counterproductive, because it undermines any potential dealings with Europe in the immediacy now, which is not what we need. It's
a bad policy, it's bad politics.
Yeah, it's bad PR, it's bad public diplomacy. You alienate nations or communities that might have been, Britain's out, but we can still work with them. And then Sir Keir comes so quickly through, and they're like, okay, fine, mate, we get it. You like your isolationist, Britain first exceptionalism mindset still, right? That certainly doesn't represent me. I consider myself European. You, live in Europe and certainly are. So, it's saying too much. He overshared, he overstated, and it's just silly. So. Yeah, and at the end of the day, British trade with the EU is 3 times that of the US, and it's not going to be possible.
And also, I mean, but Piotr, and maybe we sort of thinking about some of the wider foreign policy issues, of course, is that, you know, the UK could potentially, we could find stuck, or not stuck, hopefully, you know, if the US takes a particular position on Ukraine. And I think, you know, this is going to be the really, really big thing in many ways, that we're going to be, I mean, you know, we know there's going to be three broad foreign policy issues that we're all going to be focusing on, which is going to be the war in Ukraine is one, events in the Middle East is number two, and then what happens with China. And it's not an ordering 1, 2, 3, but those are the three broad areas, you know, where I think it's going to be particularly interesting. You know, China, there is a lot of skepticism in Europe about China as well, and a lot of concern about Europe. So it's not necessarily, you know, the way that Trump goes about it will certainly, there'll be a lot of difference. But I think there'll be people behind the scenes who will sort of be, right, okay, well, maybe this can serve our interests if handled right. The Middle East, I think, is, well, maybe we'll talk about that in a minute, but I certainly think Ukraine is the really, really potentially big issue on the horizon, which is certainly going to test Britain, because Britain has stood behind Ukraine very, very strongly. And if we now have Trump pushing for some sort of settlement, and a settlement that effectively requires Ukraine to give up territory, then that is going to put the UK and all of Europe in a very difficult position. You know, what is going to be that next step? Does Europe then say, well, to Ukraine, look, you know, if you want to continue, we will fully support you, then we will have to pick up the slack that, you know, the US is going to drop if Zelensky goes against what Trump wants.
Yeah, well, very good segue there into Ukraine. Obviously, there are three main foreign policy items, if you want to list it as such, under Trump. Ukraine is going to be, I think, the first and foremost, and the one that Trump wants to, and in his mind can, maybe not resolve, but fundamentally alter in some way. The Middle East, I think, well, we'll come to that.
Yeah, I mean, I worry a lot about the implications for the Middle East. Yeah, I mean, I do, but perhaps not in a way that, you know, might immediately stand out. But certainly, I think, you know, as I say, Ukraine, you're right. That's going to be the first thing that's going to be on, you know, in the inbox, if you like, and what Trump is going to do on that. Everyone's going to be watching.
Yeah. So on Ukraine, I think that it's quite clear Trump wants to get some kind of product, not necessarily a deal, but he wants something that he can sell to his electorate and fan base to at least keep them happy. And, you know, one of the theories that I even did a video on the channel about, right, you've covered Trump's policies in your own way as well, but one I did was about the DMZ concept, because I think a lot of people think that Trump's going to try and push for a DMZ of some form.
Yeah.
Mainly because in a PR sense, it looks good. It sounds convincing to people who aren't necessarily intricate. So I've got a leg cramp, who aren't intricate foreign policy experts. As we know, foreign policy accounted for just 3% of voters' motivations during the election on Tuesday night. And, you know, if people hear the word DMZ, they think, oh, well, that sounds good. You know, there's going to be less military, less potential World War III. And then, you know, they might use the example of the Korean Peninsula and how effective that DMZ, and then Trump can leverage that with greater PR by saying, well, you know what I managed with Kim Jong-un when I was the first leader to get the Korean leaders to shake hands at the DMZ, right? I think that's how he's going to try and market this to his fan base and the average viewer. But it's not that simple, because one, you have to assume that both independent parties are going to do what Trump wants, which they're not. And second, that's just them getting to the negotiating table. That's not even getting a product. So this isn't going to take 24. Well, obviously, I'm not going to go into the 24, 48-hour stuff. It's just rubbish. But this is the problem when you have people like Musk and others who come in and think that they can start dictating or giving foresight about how international relations and diplomacy works, particularly in the case of wartime. And that's when people go, "Oh, you're just jealous. You can't, cope." This is the word I see more than any other thing on Twitter now. It's just cope. I can't. It's so irritating. Not because I can cope, guys. I can't cope with your moronicness. But anyway, so I'll phrase it. I'll reframe what I'm going to say into a question for you, though, because apart from the fact that this isn't going to happen at the rate Trump expects or reckons, the other thing is, though, some of the comments he's made, right, that if Putin doesn't play ball, right, not necessarily give concessions, but at least engage in genuine negotiations, then Trump's going to flip the script and actually give Ukraine even more as a way to sort of punish him, so to speak. Do you think that could actually happen? Like Trump doesn't get what he wants from a peace deal, so he actually goes the other way and weaponizes Ukraine even more. Surely that would be a kick in the teeth to his voters, and people would resent him for that.
I mean, Trump is
sorry, not there.
No. I mean, I think no, but I think because it's one of these sort of things that. So I teach conflict studies, and one of the things that I often like to talk about is the importance of psychology in international relations and in conflict processes, and what drives leaders to do things. Now, we tend to have a belief that we sort of sense that leaders are and I mean this in a certain way, are above us. Not they're better than us, but we just seem to think that they're removed from the base instincts that drive the rest of us. And of course they aren't. And with Trump, we know that that's definitely not the case. That this is somebody who, is very, very fragile ego. And the other thing is that we also have a tendency to believe that institutions can restrict the individual leader. So you get an individual leader who comes in, and institutions can prevent them from doing rash things. And to an extent, that's true. But we do know that there is a very, very different approach that different leaders take on things, and that follows through in how foreign policy is implemented and things. So all of this is to say that anything is possible with Trump. And we know that he's extremely transactional. We know that he has a need to be seen to be top, a need to come out as the winner. He can't stand losing. I mean, the fact he's back in the White House is testament to that. He could just not say, right, okay, I lost, I'm just going to go into retirement. No, he had to prove it. And I think that this is a really important point, that if he feels that Putin hasn't delivered for him, then I can see him flipping on Putin, and you'd have all the theories about what have the Russians got on him and everything like that. But it's also been interesting that now we're hearing people saying that, look, it doesn't matter anymore. Frankly, everything that's been thrown at him, all the allegations, but also all the convictions, have not dented. He's back in the White House, so there's nothing that one would imagine that Putin could have on him now, which is going to change anything. So that potentially gets rid of that argument. So it's so difficult to tell. And that's the thing. We know that with, traditionally with Democrats and with traditional Republicans, where they're coming from on foreign policy. The foreign policy in most countries, tends to be an area of consensus, if anything. And we just haven't got that in the US. So yeah, I think that could be a reality, that if Putin doesn't deliver for Trump and makes Trump look bad because he's sort of said, look, I'm going to solve Ukraine, and Putin won't deliver for him, then I think it's very possible that he'll come back and say, right, okay, well, I will do anything to win this, and if that means Ukraine winning now and getting the better of Putin, then that's the thing. We just don't know. That's the problem. It's so difficult to get into Trump's head as to what, because he's not driven by the usual things that you'd imagine any other leaders to be driven by.
No, I mean, personally, I don't think he's going to withdraw from NATO. There's obviously been people who are like, yes, that's fantastic. Defund NATO, defund the UN, all this sort of stuff. No, he's not going to go that far. He's not maximalist, because at the end of the day, he's also constrained a little bit by the systems that are existing in place.
I mean, Congress also have a say over whether that can happen. But I think, and just, you know, and you're very right, but and on NATO, I think the other thing that you can present is that a lot of Americans say, well, what do we get out of NATO? But once you start to break it down, what the United States gets out of NATO, then actually, you know, it's not just the monetary, you know, the monetary saving of leaving NATO, it's the diplomatic loss, all the influence that goes with it, the ability of US arms companies that will be selling, you know, weapon systems to NATO partners, and that's not said in some sort of conspiratorial. It just is, you know, in that case. And, you know, it gives US access to all sorts of other intelligence assets. It gives US access to a network of bases. You know, it's got so many spin-offs that, you know, if you just do the plain economic cost benefit calculation, it might give you one figure. Why are we giving so much money? And the US is by far the biggest defense spender in the world, by a massive amount. I think if you add China and all the other 8 countries in the top 10, it doesn't match the US defense.
No, the next 9 are still behind the US by a considerable margin. And just on this, before maybe we pivot to the Middle East, is that, you know, in my mind, it's a bit of an interesting sort of contrast here, because Trump wants to put America first, but at the same time, if you look at what he did in terms of defense spending in his first term, and that was with certain constraints in place as well, because obviously the House was not on his side or whatever. Now he's got full reign to do a lot more, and he's going to put in place certain people. But you know, so what is it? He's not fully isolationist, though, because he wants to continue to expand the US military to ensure that American interests are protected. So he's certainly not going to be withdrawing all US naval present assets and things like that around. James seems to have disappeared briefly, but yeah. So I personally think that he's going to continue to fund the military significantly, and maybe he's not going to prioritize as many hotspots in the same way that I don't know, the Biden administration does. But I certainly think he's going to upscale certain areas that he does think are important, right? Somewhere like the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, because if he protects Israel, then they will be, you know, very key to him in the Middle East, for example. And I don't think he's going to completely forget about Europe. I certainly think he wants to see a reduction in US spending via NATO, but I think that more comes at the emphasis of Europe taking up the slack and maybe America providing research or things in other areas. Yeah, so James's connection has gone down very briefly. So we'll continue just for the time being to see, hopefully, if he can come back and join us. Everyone, if you are from James's channel, well, then, you know, hope you're enjoying the stream. If you've got any questions for myself or James, do drop them in the chat below, and I'll do my best to sort of bring them into the conversation. We have been talking for quite a while, but it's always a pleasure, I think, talking to someone of expertise and knowledge as James, because he really does do, I think, a good job. He has his perspectives and biases, of course, but I think he's aware of those biases and is able to admit them and say that, you know, objectively speaking, this is what will happen. My preferred version is this. So yeah, we talk about a lot of these sorts of things on YouTube and different spaces as well. And it's I think we're going to need it more than ever. This was something I also wanted to raise with James. Yeah, so basically, I think that the irony is a lot of mainstream people are now going to be more on the fringe. One of the main reasons you see in such a growth of of accounts on, say, Rumble or sort of X now, amongst sort of they claim to be fighting the establishment. You know, I've been censored by the mainstream media, by the deep state. Well, now sort of we're going to be sort of more like them, right? Me and James are being cancelled on X, so you've got to support. I'm just trying to get James to rejoin. So it's very interesting to see how we're going to be sort of fighting the fight now to try and ensure that disinformation and things like that don't just completely get carried away. and so on. But so, yeah, in my opinion, I think that Trump is going to be pretty heavy-handed on NATO. I don't think he's going to defund it completely. But I certainly think he's going to challenge the existing structure. And there are some ways that he could significantly gut US presence if he wants to go further than just defunding it. He could pull out of certain command structures. But there's also a hazardous approach to that, which is obviously we started off the conversation with James talking about some specific nominees. And one of them is obviously Tulsi Gabbard. And she is... I find it very difficult, basically, to imagine that the Five Eyes, which constitutes Canada, America, Britain, New Zealand, and Australia, the other four being willing to share the utmost amount of secret intelligence with someone who, by her own success, has been called a Russian asset on Russian state TV. So I think that Trump is going to find himself, even if he wants to be more America alone, will come to realize that just because America withdraws from activities in other regions doesn't suddenly mean that other countries are going to stop wanting to interfere in America, right? Just because America pulls out of the Middle East doesn't mean that Russia and China are not going to continue, or Iran in this case, to continue to try and disrupt America elsewhere because their interests are still affected. So I think Trump will be hit hard with a bit of reality there, and that, again, some of his electoral claims about doing X and Y will be watered down, or if not quietly sort of, dismissed. And then in the case of the Middle East, if James doesn't come back, he seems to be struggling to join. It would be a case where simply Benjamin Netanyahu, I think, is given free rein. I think James would agree that Trump is very supportive of the Israeli government, particularly that the fact it's the most right-leaning in the country's history. And one article I was reading in The Atlantic argued that, Trump could basically use Israel as a proxy to do whatever. The US can give Israel even more funding than the $4 billion they get a year, and that's under the Biden administration. Give them even more free rein to just do whatever they want. And in the past 6 months, what has been illustrated is that the Islamic Republic of Iran does not have as much of a self-deterrence as it was thought. And whilst they are still not to be completely dismissed, I think it has emboldened a lot of Israelis and some more hawkish members of the US defense industry and political establishment to be like, well, maybe we can actually take it to Iran. And so could you potentially see the Trump administration leveraging Israel to such an extent that they try to deal decisive blows to the Islamic Republic, right? What happened to Hezbollah and its basic implosion? The Iranians did very little to salvage it. So it makes one wonder about what could happen with the Iranians in that regard. And I think Trump will also, other than dealing with Iran and sort of safeguarding Israel, his other main priority will be normalization of Saudi-Israeli ties, making them official. And MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, has been very, I think, buoyed by the Trump win. It certainly benefits him. And I think certain countries that might lose out are Egypt, quite a lot, because they've been balancing with Russia as well. And also potentially Syria and Iraq, of course. Trump's wanting to pull the forces out of Syria. And that means that that gives free rein for the Iranians to potentially come in through entities like the Bad Organization, I believe it's called, and influence it there. So quite a lot of the Middle East, I think, will be determined indirectly via Trump. I think he's just going to sort of pass it off. It's not his focus. The main focus will obviously be China. If James does manage to rejoin us soon, then we will probably touch upon that as well. James says he's going to hopefully try and rejoin us in a second. But in the meantime, yeah, it's difficult to see. There he is. We've got James back.
Hey.
That's good. There he is.
Apologies for that. We had a bit of a problem. I think we're in the midst of a thunderstorm or something here.
I was in Malaga during the Dana, which are those torrential rainfalls that they had in Valencia. So yeah, we had a very heavy set of rainfall as well, like you. But yeah, so I was just ad-libbing, although it sounded quite good to me actually. I don't know if people think, but yeah, I was talking about the situation in the Middle East. I was basically summarizing that for me, Trump is going to try to force concessions from Europe via NATO. I don't think he's going to pull out completely. and he could do some slightly more. There's levels of how far he could go, right? And he could maybe, decommission certain departments or remove certain communications. But as I said, that would have a counterproductive side, because Tulsi Gabbard, as I said, we touched upon her at the beginning. She's scary, particularly from the Five Eyes perspective. The 4 other Five Eyes members are not going to get into bed with someone who is literally seen as a Russian asset, Chinese asset.
No,
they're not going to share their information. So that was what I was talking about. And then I jumped to a quick overview of the Middle East. So if you want to jump in and maybe give any final thoughts about NATO, and then go on to the Middle East, and then we can cover that, and maybe briefly China, and then probably wrap it up. But
I think on the Middle East, this is something that I'm particularly worried about, because I think we know that the United States obviously has a very close relationship with Israel, and however one wants to sort of feel about that. But I think there's a real worry that an incoming Trump administration, there are people around Trump who will be willing to give Israel a free hand. And I think that this is the real concern, that we have on the table, whether it's realistic or not, a two-state solution. But the way that the settlements have proceeded, with what we've seen in Gaza, I think there is a genuine fear that there will be those, not a genuine fear. We know that there are people within certain elements of Israeli political system who just believe that the way to solve the problem is just force out all the remaining Palestinians, millions of them, but force them out effectively. And you even hear people sort of saying, well, why can't the Arab states take them? Why doesn't it just take them? And then we've solved that problem. And I think that this is what really worries me, that, whether Trump would give a free hand, to those advocating that solution, which, and let's call it what it is, that would amount to ethnic cleansing. I mean, that is exactly what, there are people who are proposing that outcome. So it's really, really worrying. The one thing that makes me sort of maybe a little bit more hopeful about the whole thing is that if there was one area that the previous Trump administration can say that it was successful, and I say it with reservation, because one of the particular steps they took, I really had grave disagreements on. If there was one area where they were successful, it was the Abraham Accords. So for anyone who might not be aware of it, it was the Trump administration. Previously, if I remembered rightly, it had just been Egypt and Jordan were the only 2 Arab states that had recognized Israel. And under Trump, he managed to get 4 more countries to do so. So the first to go was Bahrain, followed by the United Arab Emirates, then Sudan, and then Morocco. And the one area that I have particular grave concerns about was Morocco, because effectively the price of Moroccan recognition of Israel was that the United States recognized Western Sahara as being under Moroccan sovereignty. I won't go into the whole issue on that, but I think that was a grave, grave injustice. There were many very senior Democrats and very senior Republicans, interestingly, who were extremely critical of Trump's decision to do that, to effectively override decades of UN policy on the right of self-determination of the Sahrawis in order to do this deal. And that is what I mean when I say about Trump being arch transactional, and it's just the deal. He sold out these people, and I realize it's a strong term, but that's exactly what he did in order to get Morocco on board for the Abraham Accords. But generally speaking, the Abraham Accords are seen as the crowning foreign policy achievement of the previous Trump administration. Yeah. There will be no repeat of that, if Israel does go through with this policy. I mean, prior to the Hamas attack, it was looking very likely that they were going to be able to broker an agreement that would see Saudi Arabia recognize Israel. I mean, they had working relations in all sorts of ways, and things were improving. I think all of that's probably collapsed. We've seen recently that the Saudi Crown Prince accuse Israel of genocide. So I think that's pretty much off the table. But there will be that aspect that I think will come to the fore. If Trump has any hope that he wants to be seen as a peacemaker in the Middle East and building on what he'd done under his previous administrations.
I don't think he cares enough about it. I'm going to be blunt.
No, I think sadly you're right. But if I were to say if I have any hope at all anywhere, it would be that, because that was seen as his crowning achievement. And if he'd want to build on
for
it,
sure, I agree with you on that one. I think that I mean, look, I'll put it this way. I'll be transparent in that I don't think transactionality in certain forms is necessarily the worst policy. I think it would benefit the West to be a little bit more, maybe not transactional, but like when we've talked about this in other live streams or when we've had you on, for specific episodes, right? A lot of the issues that people who are not necessarily anti, but just opposed to Western dominance in the world order is because we preach one thing but then do another, and it undermines our ability to be considered as a credible voice if we're talking about human rights, but then we're getting into bed with Saudi Arabia, or we're still going to deal with the Taliban, right? It kind of undermines all those things. I'm not like criticizing your point. I'm just pointing out this is one of the biggest.
No, absolutely.
We talk about it, right? It's one of. I bet you some people have made comments of that sort of thing here today. So, for me, it's Trump's transactionality in certain contexts. I think is perhaps a wise move, because it means there's a reduced window for people to be able to criticize him for being like, well, hang on, you're a human rights savior, but you're dealing with the Tatmadaw in Myanmar, you hypocrites. So I don't know. I think for the Abraham Accords were an incredible achievement, I have to admit. I do wonder whether or not he can facilitate that with Saudi Arabia, given the current prevailing conditions.
No. I mean, it might be the case that in his mind, he's thinking, if I can draw a line under this war, and then is there any hope for rebuilding and being seen as the bridge between Israel and the Arab world, as he saw it's just the one, if you like, small fragment of hope that we might see. But I agree with you. I think it's highly unlikely, and I think the nominations that he'd made, I
think some countries could also fall out. I think Turkey could suffer potentially if Erdogan isn't willing to play ball, because Turkey tries to hedge its bets against both being in NATO but also hanging out with the Chinese and a few other countries. He's been heavily critical of Israel. There was even a threat. I think someone was suggesting that they might cut relations with Israel. Well, that's going to go down well with the Turks and the Americans then under Trump. So I think that Turkey could potentially
very good point.
Suffer, but also Egypt. I think Egypt, as being one of the other main Arab powers, regional powers in the area, could potentially suffer because they themselves have tried to sort of counterbalance. During the Soviet times, the Cold War, they were taking arms from the Soviets whilst also supporting the Americans or whatever. So they're a non-major NATO ally as well, if I remember correctly, like Morocco is now. So I do think you could see a couple of nations particularly suffering under Trump administration if they don't play in the way that he wants them to. I think the beneficial will be Israel, obviously. Saudi Arabia probably will. Iran's going to absolutely, wow, that's not going to go well for the mullahs. But yeah, I don't know. And I know you need to bounce soon, but I wanted a quick take. How terrified should Beijing be, and Xi Jinping? Because I think they're petrified.
Well, I think it's the question of how concerned we should all be, because the tensions that ramp up between the United States and China. I mean, it's as people often point out, they're in the middle of a Cold War at the moment. But I mean, it's a complex relationship. We know that. It isn't just about sort of political differences. I mean, there is a lot of economic activity that goes on, and then you've got Taiwan, and I think in many ways, Taiwan is the confusing point. I was reading something very interesting recently. So, under the previous Trump administration, Trump was very, very supportive of Taiwan. I mean, Mike Pompeo, when he was Secretary of State, essentially, all right, it was the last embers of the Trump administration, but essentially took relations with Taiwan forward and made them more overt and public than we'd ever seen before. I mean, the United States has obviously stood behind Taiwan for rather a long time, But it's always done it sort of much more carefully, been very careful about officials being seen to be meeting with Taiwanese officials, and that went out of the window. So there's a real question about where Trump now stands on Taiwan, because as been pointed out, that on the one hand, is he still going to be supportive of Taiwan? Or others have pointed out that Trump in many ways has his own beef with Taiwan about, semiconductors, and, Taiwan is a huge producer. It's largest in the world, a lot of American products. Apparently Trump is unhappy about some of the ways that Taiwan is conducting its business and stuff like that. So is he, again, we get back to this transactionality. Is he going to be going to the Taiwanese and saying, listen, if you want defense against Beijing, you're going to have to, do whatever you need to be doing in order to make chips cheaper or whatever it is, or allowing some of that technology to come to the USA, opening up factories in the United States so that we can produce them at home and things like that. It's going to be really, really interesting to see how that plays out as well. That, isn't going to be that sort of political element. And again, we come back to this point that I made at the start, which is there's no apparent continuity that we can point to between Trump 1 and Trump 2. And that's what is making everything so difficult to tell at the moment. We knew who the figures were from the first Trump administration. If any of them had been brought back, if Nikki Haley had been brought back into UN, that would have been one thing. If Mike Pompeo had been brought back, but Trump made that very, very public statement within a couple of days of having been elected that neither of them was coming back. Now, Nikki Haley is saying that, well, she didn't want to. She turned down a job offer from him. Be that as it may, we just don't have that continuity to know. And I think that this is what, if you like, as on a final note, is making all of this so very, very interesting and so hard to tell, because we know what these different figures are. We know that they've got fundamentally differing points of view on things. How is it all going to work? How is Trump going to referee this? Who's going to be that experienced voice in the room that Trump might defer to? All of this is open. And I'll just say as one last thing that, I also think is incredibly important, is that under the previous Trump administration, the State Department was really hollowed out. The US lost a lot of diplomatic expertise. A lot of senior figures retired. A lot of middle ranking just said, you know what, we're out of here, go in. And it's taken time. And I don't think a lot of people realize just how much damage it did to sort of US diplomatic capabilities. And so whoever goes in at the State Department, if they do what Tillerson did in the first part of the last Trump administration, and really it just wreaked havoc on US diplomatic standing and its ability to carry out foreign policy, I think that is also something that we need to be taking a good look at. And so it's going to be really interesting that Rubio, if he is confirmed, and I agree with you, he's probably more likely to be confirmed than many of the other Trump nominees that we've seen. It's going to be very interesting to see how he runs the State Department, because, in many ways, Blinken in recent years, maybe not the household name, but he seems to have been very competent. This was somebody who had been educated abroad, I think he speaks fluent French, and he was quietly getting on and doing that diplomatic stuff. And I think very impressively. So maybe Rubio will be in a position to do that. I'm sure he's a Spanish speaker, and that's a big part of the world that, he can reach out to, and that'll probably be quite high on his list of priorities. But it will be interesting to see how that also plays out in the State Department, if you look at the top down, but also when he sat around that cabinet table, what sort of influence is he going to have, with all those other powerful voices speaking in different directions. So, plenty of room for chaos still.
Yeah, I think I'd wrap up by simply saying that it's a spectrum again, right? To bring it full circle. Rubio, I think, is less worse than some of the other nominations. He's not a Matt Gaetz, right? He is very hawkish, but he's still within the realm of, if this is the Overton window, and sort of this is still sort of the area of reasonable grounds, and then so you've got radicality over here, if that's even a word, right? He's not a Matt Gaetz, right? He's still. I don't think he's going to throw the handbook out of the window. I'm worried maybe over some of the policies, like Trump's suggested some very Zionistic types for the role of ambassador, which is not going to be good for the Palestinian cause and perspective. So there is that to keep in mind. But it is, as you say, because of just the reach and breadth that the US has across the world, you know, you put one person in place who has some more unconventional, shall we say, views on certain things, it can completely undermine the entire thing. You know, he's going to pull out of the climate accords. He's going to do some pretty crazy things in certain areas that he just doesn't, you know, if he doesn't consider it to be of value to the US from a business dealings, especially, he's not going to give a shit. And he's just going to put some person who doesn't care whether they're doing it, you know, like I was cross with Biden for not doing more to levy relations in Africa. Well, Trump's going to completely not give a shit. If he does do anything, he's going to try and just deal with countries where he can get some kind of resources and money or some kind of transactionality from. But in terms of trying to stop the civil war in Sudan, no chance. DRC, nothing. Sahel, nothing.
No, so, I know I was meant to talk about 6 minutes on the Balkans, but one thing I will just chip in is precisely this. There's been lots and lots of speculation. I got calls from media in the Balkans, you know, for anyone who knows this, you know, Southeast Europe is actually, you know, my first starting area of international relations work, and it's an area that I've worked on throughout my career. So I sort of know a lot about Southeast Europe, so stretching through the Balkans, Turkey, Greece, Cyprus. And there was a lot of speculation in the Balkans about what a Trump administration was going to be and, you know, what policies he was going to be pursuing and everything. We just don't know. And I don't think it's going to be high on the list of priorities, frankly. I just can't see. It might be, but at the moment, it just doesn't look like it's be there. And so all this speculation, I'm sure this is going on in, you know, in all these different places about what Trump is going to mean. And frankly, we just don't know anything at the moment. It's, you know, we know that Ukraine, Middle East, China are going to be the three issues on the agenda. Beyond that, really, really difficult to tell at the moment where priorities are going to lie. And it's going to come down to individuals and whether they can persuade Trump to get interested. So last time around, it seemed highly unlikely that Trump would get involved in the Balkans. But there he was, sort of, you know, through this Rick Grenell figure.
So no, that's a good point.
It could well be that somebody manages to get his ear and just say, look, Mr. President, I suggest that you really give a go on this because we can get you a win on this. And that's what he wants.
Well, anywhere that he can be seen as getting the win in a PR political sense, he will do, even if it's as well.
It's difficult to tell at the moment, isn't it? You know, we know what the three areas are going to be, but beyond that, we are living in confusing times.
Very
all sorts of speculation going on here. We have just been speculating for 2 hours on it, and blue sky.
I think speculation is when one doesn't have much basis for understanding, and I think you have a good basis of understanding. So I wouldn't be so you know, sort of self you know, critical or sort of, you know, big yourself up. You know what you're talking about, James. But yes, it's been a pleasure. I do note one last point, which is that you are as English as I am, which is that whenever one is very worried about something, they say the word interesting. Oh, this is it's going to be very interesting to see. My person is going to be terrifying, petrifying, disconcerting, all those sorts of adjectives to describe it. But you prefer to be diplomatic because you work in that field and often consult with those types. So you need to be much more tentative or delicate with your languages, rather. So wording. So anyway, my quibs aside, everyone, thank you very much for watching. Hope this was fun. We'll be back doing these probably, you know, on an intermittent basis when something particularly arises, or maybe we'll just do it whenever we kind of feel like it, which is sort of what we felt like doing with it today. And if you enjoyed it, guys, then, you know, do go and check out James's stuff. He does awesome work on everything you can imagine, and, you know, we work together as well as we can. But anyway, take care everyone, and as I like to say on my show, The Global Gambit, you got to get playing or be played. So wish you peace of mind. Take care, everyone.
Bye there.
All right, cheers.